Hello, I'm Tom Sharp, and we welcome you to this third episode in a four-part series entitled The Foundations for a Biblical Worldview. So let's get started. Many men and women have been thrust onto the world stage in days gone by. Some are recognized for their good and positive contributions, and some for their evil that they've unleashed upon their fellow man. Some of these men and women sought to be recognized. They purposefully pursued their place and purpose in history. But others seem to have blundered their way into history, and in many instances, it is these that we inexplicably hold to a greater degree of responsibility for the ultimate impact of their life. When confronted with their seemingly unreasonable actions, we are frequently motivated to exclaim, "What were they thinking?" Perhaps one of the more familiar of these blunders is by a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was the Roman governor of the province of Judea, who lived in the city of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. On the night of Jesus' betrayal by Judas, Jesus was first taken by the Jewish governing body called the Sanhedrin, who, after having illegally convened, they nevertheless conducted a kangaroo court in which they hurriedly passed judgment upon him, at which time he was passed on to the Roman court. While the Jewish law allowed the Sanhedrin to recommend and execute capital punishment, the Romans had prohibited them from doing so. Therefore, it was necessary for Pilate to become involved in what he apparently considered to be of little importance. It was neither his decision in this issue nor the outcome of his decision that makes him of interest to this particular study. It is instead a comment he makes in his interrogation of Jesus. Let's listen in on their conversation.
You are a king, then?
King is your word. My task is to bear witness to the truth.
Truth? What is truth?
Some might think Pilate to be significantly inquisitive and curious, to seek for a definition of truth from this Jewish rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth. A few theologians feel that Pilate was effectively echoing a similar response as did that of King Agrippa when confronted by the truth from the Apostle Paul.
Paul said to Agrippa, "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Acts 26:27-28.
But it is very possible that Pilate's response was motivated by entirely different reasons. Pilate was Roman through and through. While his birthplace is unknown, it was probably somewhere in Europe, well within the greater Roman Empire. Thus, we can reasonably and assuredly state that he was a product of that culture and mindset, one which we know to be deeply bathed in materialism and humanism. A predominant tenet found within Roman philosophy was the inability to ascertain a reality or truth that existed outside of oneself. When Pilate asked the question, "What is truth?" he is not really asking Jesus to relay to him an absolute, undeniable, self-existent truth that resided uniquely and totally in him. Rather, Pilate is acknowledging that this Jesus standing before him has asserted that he knows the truth, or more specifically, is the truth, which most likely Pilate thought to be merely his own tortured opinion. In Pilate's mind, the Jewish leaders who brought Jesus to him were wanting the Roman government to execute a man for expressing his opinion about a subject that everyone knows cannot violate any law, because there is no truth according to the Romans. When Pilate asked this famous question, "What is truth?" it was a flippant response to what he believed to be a childish statement. Even Jesus himself should know truth cannot be grasped as an absolute reality, thought Pilate. This, in turn, dictates Pilate's response to the crowd: "I find no fault in him." So how important is worldview? It can have dire consequences. The story is told of a little village that was tucked away in between two large mountain ranges. Now, this little village had a small flock of sheep, it is said, and in the course of time it became necessary to hire a shepherd. After a brief time of searching, the village elders settled on a particular young man, and to complete their interview, they took him out to the edge of the village to show him the sheep. "These will be your charges," they told him. They continued by telling him, "Oh, one last thing. There are wolves in these hills, and if you see one, just yell, 'Woof, woof,' and we'll come running with pitchforks and clubs." So the young man agreed and followed their plan, and days went by. The young man found himself thoroughly enjoying the idyllic setting. One day, as he was resting and looking at the clouds, he thought he caught an unusual movement out in the corner of his eye. He sat up and looked more closely. There it was again, on the side of the mountain. Something was moving. Wolves, he thought anxiously. But something kept him from calling out for help. The object now moved closer, and it dawned on him it wasn't wolves at all. It was a lion. So he cried, "Lion, lion!" He glanced backward toward the village for the elders, but he saw no movement. He turned back again to locate the lion, and by this time the lion had worked its way to the edge of the meadow and was definitely beginning to stalk the sheep. So he cried louder, "Lion, lion!" Again, to his dismay, there was still no movement in the village. When he returned his attention to the flock, he saw that the lion was now approaching one of the sheep. He screamed at the top of his voice, "Lion, lion!" Still no help came from the village. Alas, it was now too late, for the lion was now tearing and rending through one of the sheep. The young man sank to the ground, benumbed and in shock. Slowly he got up and made his way into the village to report sadly to the elders. When he arrived in the village, he found the elders gathered in the village square. After much effort, he was able to choke out what had happened in the meadow. When he had finished telling the story, he looked at the head elder and said haltingly, "But I cried out, 'Lion, lion,' 3 times, and you didn't come." The elder looked at the young man and with a patronizing tone said, "Young man, there are simply no lions in these hills. It is the wolves we fear." The young man learned a very important lesson that day about the strength of cultural presupposition and its influence on human beliefs. People will only believe what they deduce to be true. The expression, "all truth is God's truth," has been gaining in popularity within many Christian circles. And while it sounds true, does it represent a biblical understanding of truth? The big question is how we know something to be true. Is there an objective rather than a subjective standard for truth? Is it possible to discover truth beyond the shadow of a doubt? Is there objective truth that is true for all people, in all places, and at all times? Or is truth relative, and can it change depending upon the environment or other circumstances? We introduced the subject of presupposition in the previous episode entitled, "Knowledge, the Foundation of Truth." But it would be very beneficial for us to revisit this important concept, for we all operate our daily lives under the influence of a set of presuppositions far more than we realize. The strength of the presuppositional base that guides our lives is directly proportionate to our faith in that presupposition. For example, I could say that I strongly believe the sun will rise in the east tomorrow. Now, while this comes from my personal experience and from my understanding of the laws surrounding this phenomenon, it is much stronger than that. It primarily emanates from my strong belief that the Bible is the full body of truth, which tells me it was the great Creator who made the covenant with day and night to regulate both the length of the day and night, and it tells me that this same Creator promised Noah that all generations to follow the flood would be visited with seed time and harvest, with cold and heat, with summer and winter, and with day and night. An evolutionist would hold the same strong belief that the sun will rise in the east, but his beliefs are not based on the same presupposition as mine. He would contend that it has been that way for millions of years, and because of uniformity, it will be that way for millions of years to come, but he doesn't know why. Now, the primary difference between these two contrasting worldviews about the rising of the sun is entirely due to the presupposition governing each worldview. The first presupposes an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent deity who is sovereign over all and whose word is infallible. The latter presupposes matter, chemistry, time, and uniform processes as the governing mechanism for all observable reality. Actually, there is no other way to approach God or His Word other than from a presuppositional faith. Remember, it was the writer to the Hebrews that said, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he that cometh to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him."
Clearly, faith has a role in how we perceive the very world around us. Everybody has a filter, if you will, that you use to interpret events, to interpret actions, to understand what's going on. And so certainly your faith is part of that filter. What your presupposition is of where you came from will determine then why you think you're here and where you think you're going. You know, if you say, well, I came from a cosmic accident, then clearly you are going to perceive that you're not going anywhere, because accidents don't go anywhere, and what's your purpose of being here? Well, you don't have a purpose. So faith is very much involved in just how you live your day-to-day, but also, of course, in how you interpret science. Science ultimately is a tool. It's the scientists that make the interpretations. They say it's, many times I want to couch it in terms of it's science versus religion, but it's not science versus religion. It's the opinion of some humans that are scientists versus the opinion of other humans that may or may not be scientists. So that's what the real battle is as far as the scientific arguments. It's just really the opinions of people, and it ultimately based on their faith.
Evolutionist Roger Lewin said in his book, Bones of Contention, that preconceptions are rarely acknowledged because this, after all, would be unscientific. And yet, preconceptions are an individual scientist's guide to how to view the world with a degree of order that allows structured questions to be asked. The anonymous aphorism, "I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it," is a continuing truth in science.
Many believers and non-believers alike consider science to be the source of objective truth. This is definitely true for some areas and topics of study. We took note of that fact in the last episode. Unfortunately, many also believe that if science cannot or does not prove a particular idea, that idea cannot be real or true. But is this really the case? Can we readily see the influence of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in this conclusion? I think we can.
In Southern Europe, the Reformation provides a kind of foundational base upon which enlightenment comes. But usually the term enlightenment is identified with, say, 16th to 18th century or maybe early 19th century development, where there's a shift from the authorized authority. Often it's religious authority, but sometimes it's also political authority. And part of what happens there is you have multiple views, like, say, multiple churches, Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, rival churches, or multiple philosophical views. And this is where the Renaissance does provide rival philosophical views. You know, Aristotelianism and Platonism are on the rise again, which means that with these rivals, there's no longer a unanimity in Europe. That's especially seen when you know, Europe goes into an all-Europe war, you know, the 30 Years' War or something like that, or when you have 3 popes at one time. That calls into question the authority of a king or emperor, or a pope, or a church. It means that people have to choose for themselves. And so the Enlightenment is all about trying to own that I have to make the decision as to what I will believe, as to what is true. And you can see that shifting in Descartes, into Locke, the encyclopedias in France. And what they do is they draw upon all these classical Greco-Roman points of view, and often parodying the biblical text into showing that, look, these are really authoritative, or these are credible, and what they're trying to do ultimately is remove the authority of the king, which means they've got to attack the biblical text in something like, say, Romans 13, and elevate the authority of the individual so that it's I who can know truth because it's either rationally accessible to me or personally by my senses accessible to me. And so the shift of the authority of truth is to the individual rather than the church or the king or some other group or council.
There are two proposed sources for truth: spatial revelation and natural revelation. Spatial revelation is offered by the God of the Holy Scripture, while observable cause-effect relationships in nature are often referred to as natural revelation. Both are valid and compatible within their unique contexts and boundaries. There is never any contradiction between what the Bible says about the world and what scientists see in their investigations of the world. The danger comes from giving both these knowledge sources equal authority. Bible believers can utilize natural revelation if they use biblical discernment and worldview regarding the accuracy of conclusions that are drawn from any proposed interpretation of empirical research. However, secular scientists dismiss spatial revelation as being merely faith-based religious superstition while promoting their own faith-based assumptions about evolution as being true, objective science. Here is a subtle and very important point, one that we must not miss. Empirical investigation of cause-effect relationships that occur in nature, what we generally refer to as the scientific method, can produce true, reliable information. Now listen carefully. Even though secular scientists dismiss biblical revelation as being trustworthy for origins issues, their conclusions in a given area of research still may be accurate as long as it regards cause-effect observations that can be observed, tested, repeated, and possibly falsified. In other words, science can and does find truth, but the processes of science are limited to objective, time-constrained testing, evaluation, repetition with the possibility of disproving a former conclusion. The processes of science are not valid to determine truth about your origin, your identity, your purpose, or your destiny. I state this again for emphasis. There is a vast difference between scientific opinion and the opinion of scientists. Scientific opinion includes those conclusions that have been produced by scientific research, while the opinion of scientists, even though it may be an educated opinion, is nothing but the beliefs of people called scientists.
Naturalism is a term. It's a sort of fancy term for assuming that everything in the world is material and obeys material laws. So it's a fancy metaphysical term for something that's a guess about how the world really is. Certainly not a fact. It's not scientifically true. It's, as I said, a guess, an assumption about the way things are. And no one should ever assume that naturalism is the only approach a scientist could take. No one should ever assume that the naturalist assumption is obvious or valid. It's just that. It's a guess. It's an assumption.
If we can't use the scientific method to explore the point of the subject of origins, then we have to be guided by our own personal philosophies and our own personal paradigms and mindsets. And that's not bad. What's bad is when you don't admit that that's what's guiding you. I think it's always good to put a little footnote and, on your own conclusions saying, but I was guided by this model, I was guided by this mindset or this paradigm. what happens so often in the literature and in the media, and especially on cable TV science programs, is such conclusions that are clearly guided by paradigms are presented as totally objective, empirical fact when that's actually not actually possible to even do or achieve, but it's sold as having been achieved. And I think that's where the lies and dishonesty comes in. You know, it's not dishonest to bring forth theories and then to present them, even though they do come from a particular mindset. It's dishonest to do that and say, it doesn't come from a particular mindset. I am presenting this to you, and we know it's empirical. This is data. No, a theory is not data, but it's often presented that way. For instance, Theodosius Dobzhansky's 1973 quote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution," is a horrid statement for a scientist to make. This is basically proclaiming a theoretical construct to be the construct, the only construct that exists. And this is, as brilliant as Dobzhansky was, this was an intellectual dishonesty of highest caliber.
Having someone give stark, contrasting examples of the difference between scientific opinion and the opinion of scientists is one thing. But how difficult is it in everyday life to make this discernment? A classic example of this limitation in man's knowledge, as well as a demonstration of the dubious conclusions sometimes sanctioned as true science, was printed in the March 2003 issue of National Geographic for Kids. On page 7, the article says,
"For a long time, scientists believed that the Grand Canyon was carved out slowly over millions of years. Scientists also thought that the canyon had finished forming around 1.2 million years ago. But new research has turned both theories upside down. Geologists now think that the Grand Canyon grew in quick, violent spurts from massive flooding of the Colorado River. Scientists are also now second-guessing the Grand Canyon's age. They think parts of the canyon are only about 750,000 years old, a baby, geologically speaking, and in some places it still may be growing."
For those accustomed to reading such scientific material, this sounds entirely scientific. But look a little closer at what was said in this article.
"For a long time, scientists believed that the Grand Canyon was carved out slowly over millions of years. Scientists also thought that the canyon had finished forming around 1.2 million years ago. But new research has turned both theories upside down. Geologists now think that the Grand Canyon grew in quick, violent spurts from massive flooding of the Colorado River. Scientists are also now second-guessing the Grand Canyon's age. They think parts of the canyon are only about 750,000 years old, a baby geologically speaking, and in some places it still may be growing."
Did you observe in this article from the National Geographic for Kids how the opinion of scientists can be understood to be scientific opinion? Look at how many times an opinion word was used in just one paragraph. The word believed, the word thought, new research, theories, think, second guessing, maybe, 8 separate times in 6 sentences. Not only have they shown their cards, so to speak, but they have also left themselves an out. They said, it still may be growing, and it all sounds so authentic. In actuality, however, the first article reveals that scientists have dogmatically influenced millions of school children and their parents for decades, not on the basis of genuine scientific knowledge, but by what they believed to be true. All of a sudden, Professor Roger Lewin's quote, alluded to earlier, takes on a much grander significance. Remember, he said the continuing reality in science is epitomized by, "I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it."
Unfortunately, it's very clear there's a common motive. When I am discussing with someone who is not what I would call a biblical creationist, what I often will work to do is try to get to that ultimate motive. In other words, well, why would you say that? Why would you think that? And inevitably, when you get them finally to a point where they're articulating, it will come out. The reason that they take this position is because that's what they are convinced science is saying. Science is saying the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, the universe is 13.5 billion years old, and of course that keeps changing, but anyway, science is saying this. So science is saying billions of years. Therefore, it must be billions of years. So somewhere in that text in Genesis, I have to fit billions of years. So it becomes an external interpretation. It becomes that presupposition. The presupposition is the science has established the Earth is billions of years old. Therefore, somehow, I've got to work it into the text in Genesis. So that becomes, unfortunately, the underlying where the scientific claims, and again, it's not science is saying, science is simply a tool. It is certain scientists saying, and suddenly they have become the they have become the authorities. Must be true. Must be true. Therefore, I must fit it in.
It would be very profitable at this point to discuss a common misconception surrounding the idea contained in the term theory. Generally, we assume that the term theory refers to an unestablished idea or hypothesis. Now, Webster's New World Dictionary, 3rd edition, defines the word theory as a mental viewing or contemplation, a speculative idea or plan as to how someone or something might be done, a systematic statement of principle involved a formulation of apparent relationships or underlying principles of certain observed phenomenon which has been verified to some degree, or the branch of science consisting in a knowledge of its principles and methods rather than in its practice, pure, as opposed to applied science. And finally, a mere conjecture or guess. It probably is safe to say that for the general public, numbers 2 and 6 comprise the predominant understanding of the term. But as we have intimated throughout this episode, the unaware assertion of presupposition can have grim consequences in meanings and semantics. There is no doubt about it. Whoever defines the terms we are commonly using all the time influences our thinking about truth. I had a conversation a few years ago with the leading attorney representing Eagle Forum in a church-state litigation in the state of Alabama over replacing the word fact with the word theory in the textbooks of science for that state. The attorney was excited because the Christian delegation had received a favorable decision, they thought. The presiding judge ordered the words to be changed. Unfortunately, all that effort actually gained nothing significant, and here's why. The phrase scientific theory does not mean the same thing to a scientist as it does to a non-professional scientist or to the man on the street. The layman or the non-professional scientist will interpret the word theory to be nothing but mere guess, conjecture, or whim, something not significant at all. In the world of science, however, a theory is carefully formed and justified by limited laboratory research, but legitimate research nonetheless. Therefore, changing science textbooks to use the word theory instead of the word fact regarding the meaning of the word evolution is meaningless. The evolutionist will walk away from this battle tongue-in-cheek, laughing all the way back to his university. There is justifiable cause for exasperation over the current ponderous representation of evolution as a scientific theory, which is obvious in the above-mentioned National Geographic article. The theories being referred to in this article were not scientific at all. These theories, as are all theories regarding evolution and any of its corollaries, are simply the opinions of naturalistic scientists. They're based on the predictions of evolutionary processes from an ad hoc explanation, which are the stories that provide a plausible evolutionary solution for origins, all of which reject the God of Scripture. And in this particular case, we're looking at a godless formation of the Grand Canyon. Man has, of course, developed the sciences and its processes, but the original introduction came from the Creator. The Bible says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." From the beginning, God's desire was that man should study the creation, understand its functions and purposes, and then govern it wisely. This directive is properly called the cultural or the scientific mandate, because to subdue implies that we master the creation by understanding its functions and its processes, and thus the pure or the research sciences were introduced in this manner. And taking dominion suggests the applied sciences and technology. In effect, then, God laid down the guiding principles and mandated that man work out the details. The word subdue in this passage is the Hebrew word kabosh, meaning to tread down or to conquer or subjugate. So in regard to creation, this essentially means to master by knowing or understanding. And as is illustrated, for example, in the debate over the true nature of the T-Rex, whether he is a predator or a scavenger. Conquering God's mysteries in creation is a formidable task. These mysteries are immense and do not easily yield their secrets. So what about the T-Rex? Was he a predator or was he a scavenger? There are well-informed scientists on each side of this debate, and now some apparently straddle both sides. A recent article in USA Today suggests that a young T-Rex could probably chase down its prey, but as it aged or grew older, it would slow down and become a scavenger. The fact is, no one really knows for sure because the T-Rex can no longer be observed. This illustrates the formidable and challenging nature of true scientific research. The word translated dominion in Genesis passage is the Hebrew word radah, and it means to tread down or to have dominion or to reign over. It is the Creator's desire that the man he created govern or control the creation on the basis of newly found understanding that could be produced through subduing. Sir Francis Bacon, generally believed to be the father of the scientific method, in effect, rediscovered this scriptural mandate.
How do you develop a medicine? How do you develop a particular tool? Those are developed in many instances by a scientific process of study, of extracting certain enzymes out of a plant or extracting certain chemicals out of a plant or out of a microbe and using them for medicine, and you determine that by scientific study of how it works in the human body and how it, what effects it may have on animals and such. So science is really an extension of God instructing humans to use the earth for his benefit, for human benefit. And it, again, is not coincidental that societies that were not Christian, such as the early Chinese society, for example, that were not Christian, they had technological capability. They had, paper and gunpowder and such, but they did not exploit scientifically that material because they viewed creation as essentially little domains of demigods, and therefore if I exploit this, if I utilize this, that's infringing on a demigod's terrain, and so I shouldn't do that. Whereas, see, from a Christian perspective, based upon God's instructions in the Bible, it's not demigods in rocks and trees and animals and such. They're all products of the creation, and we're told to use them. Go ahead and use them. Now, you're to, as any steward, you are to use them judiciously. You're to use them as you would be expected with the kind of care and caretaking that you would expect anybody to take care of your property, but it's there for you to use. And so it's not coincidental that Christians, Bible-believing creationists, were the ones that began to develop science. That's where it came from. Science did not come from atheists. Science did not come from materialists. Science came from creationists. That's why the great pioneers of science were creationists, because they understood God said go ahead and use this. God said it can be used. God said it's okay to use this. And in using it then, we can develop laws of science, we can develop scientific protocols, and we can develop products of science that serve mankind.
So how then does the Bible believer arm himself for a successful presentation of real truth in a culture that believes science to be the only dependable process for finding truth? How can we discern between those things that are true science, as defined for us in the scientific mandate in Genesis 1:28, and the evolutionary falsehoods that are masquerading as truth under the banner of science? This is especially challenging in the face of the persuasive measures that are being used today to promote evolutionary humanism as true scientific theory or law. This is the obstacle we must overcome if we are to be successful in the evangelization of America today. I have often said that the confusion over origins issues could be resolved for the vast majority of Christians if we genuinely knew two things: what the Bible really says about creation, and if we understood the limitations of the scientific process. As I travel throughout America, I find a startling condition pervading the conservative church community. Most professing believers are far more a product of the American socialization process than they are of the Bible, and the American culture is thoroughly secular. Therefore, most professing Christians have a secular worldview, and truth is viewed through their secular lenses. Consider, for example, that MTV began their television intrusion into our homes in August of 1981, and this intrusion has continued nonstop for nearly 30 years. As a result, I find that most of our believing young people know more about pop culture and the headliners than they do the Scripture. No wonder Josh McDowell recently tells us that 98% of American believers cannot explain what they believe about the Bible and why they believe it. The MTV type of mental and social conditioning that is being inculcated into the psychological and cognitive recesses of our children's mind is but a reflection of a greater problem and deterrent we have today in biblical worldview development. And while evolutionary theory doesn't seem to have the same glamour or the same appeal to the adolescent mind as does MTV, it too has been successfully implanted into their souls by the same kinds of techniques. The culture has programmed them into believing that cultural consensus is true. This is nothing new, but it works very effectively. Thus, our society is thoroughly conditioned by the manipulation of unseen agents with hidden agendas. This same deceptive methodology has been used with great success in the marketing of the evolutionary story. Evolution is openly declared to be a fact, even though it has never been proven, and there is no better example of this than the unambiguous, straightforward remarks of Harvard professor Dr. Ernst Mayr, spoken in September of 1999 in a lecture given before the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. He said, "No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we know to simply be fact. Likewise, most of Darwin's particular theses have been fully confirmed, such as that of common descent, the gradualism of evolution, and the explanatory theory of natural selection." Mayr calls evolution a fact, but it is a fact without evidence. The only valid fact there is that he believes evolution to be a fact. That a fairy tale of this magnitude could gain such revered academic status tells us two salient features about the marketing phenomenon provided for evolution. First, we see the exalted reputation of anything considered scientific. That is why the greater American public has been significantly impacted by evolution, even though most Americans do not believe it to be true. I think it incredibly interesting that Brian Sullivan of the Philadelphia Inquirer, January 2nd, 81, reported at the 147th National Meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science that evolution was voted in as a scientific law. In other words, well-trained scientists, convinced of the accuracy of evolution, violated and ignored the scientific process. And in spite of what they really knew scientifically, they voted in evolution as a scientific law. Is that the way real science is done? Of course it isn't. Their decision to elevate the hypothesis of materialism to scientific status was based on popular opinion and consensus, and not on the demands of valid research and peer-reviewed evidence. Secondly, the successful marketing of evolution demonstrates the formative influence that secular scientists have in our present culture. Because science has provided a cure for so many diseases and maladies, and has produced a myriad of gadgets for our convenience and leisure, and has developed tremendous technological advances that have made our lives on this planet so much easier, men and women of science are looked upon as a superhuman agency for problem solving. Dr. David Brees adds that,
in the word scientist, we have one of the most revered titles of our day, because the word denotes one of the most respected professions of our time. It might even be argued that modern times have themselves been created by the phenomena denoted in the phrase, the advance of science. Science and scientists have taken to themselves credentials deemed unassailable in our culture. So much is this the case that any finding about anything can be rendered instantly déclassé, lower in rank, by tagging it with this criticism: it's not scientific. On the other hand, the sublime truth is that almost anything can be established instantly when the expression "science has taught us" is applied to it. Being scientific is to travel the high road of acceptance and status. So persuasive is this assumption that many strange notions have gained credibility when their proponents have applied to them the term scientific.
the unqualified acceptance and promotion of evolutionism as scientific fact by the vast majority of Western secular scientists, philosophers, and theologians has in all reality elevated a terrible belief system with terrible implications for biblical faith into the rarefied atmosphere of being truth about origin, when in fact Paul called it the lie. This is the epitome of scientism, which is the presentation of philosophical propositions that are presented as if they were genuine science.
Atheistic evolutionists and naturalistic scientists don't even use the word scientism very often. They'll use it in conjunction with the word reductionism, and they don't use it very much. Philosophers of science will use the word scientism, but because evolutionists are so baptized within the concept themselves, they don't like to use the word. Scientism and reductionism seem to be an effort to simplify things to an extent that you can take these simple things and apply and cherry pick and choose among the simplified things, and only choose the simplified things that then can be applied to some sort of proving of your concepts as being valid, and leaving the other ones. I think reductionism is good because it makes things simpler for everyone to understand, and it guides our overall thinking better. And it's Occam's razor that the simplest explanations tend to be the true ones in the end. But when you take all these simplified things and then you just cherry pick which things work for you, in other words, which things favor your line of thinking, you're no longer being a scientist. Now you're being an evangelist, perhaps. I think better word is a propagandist.
Scientism is the use of semantic illusion to convey the idea that evolutionism, in all of its many materialistic and naturalistic forms, is a demonstrable fact. The forms and applications of the educational use of scientism are many. This devastating technique has been the method by which evolutionary materialism has been successfully marketed to the American public for the last 140 years or so, and is presently affecting our sons and daughters regarding their view of truth.
Darwin was typical of the philosophical approach to science, which is nothing wrong with that. And he always couched his things with might be or should be or perhaps. he would always couch his thoughts in tentative terms. And I think that caution was a good habit of his. But it was the people around him at the time that seized upon these ideas, stripped them of the tentative wording, stripped them of words like suppose, and also stripped further ideas from the notion that they depended on previous assumptions. Stripped them, removed all of the hints that this new idea depended on a few previous ideas that were based on assumptions, and then ran with these ideas. In other words, sanitized them from all hint or clue that Darwin intended to be tentative at all, but that Darwin had made a discovery. Well, he'd put together a theoretical framework, a construct, but he himself never said that I've proved it. He said that I will leave it to future generations to prove it or disprove it. And he even used those words like disprove, and it could be disproven this way or that way or the other. If this happens, then I'll be proven to be wrong. And he was being very honest about it. But there were people who were highly motivated at the time to remove from the philosophy of science the concept of a creator, of a God, of a supreme being, of a higher power. And this again is really just the pride of man, the pride of life. And Romans 1:28, I think it is, says, they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. The Bible actually predicts this kind of thinking. And that really led to the scientism of naturalistic philosophical approach to science, of naturalism versus the whole picture of the universe, keeping the door open, that actually there might be more than we with our senses can find.
Charles Darwin became the world's greatest progenitor of evolutionary scientisms. By this I mean he had conceived an idea about origins that he borrowed from the ancient Greeks, who obviously received it from their ancient ancestors, specifically Nimrod, who received it obviously from the devil, and speculated about it endlessly, building assumption upon assumption upon assumption. He often began his argumentation in The Origin of Species and his book, The Descent of Man, with the phrase, "Let us now suppose." And on this supposition, he would construct a marvelous materialistic possibility. And without proof, he would then state this supposition as fact, upon which he quickly built another supposition. So is all truth God's truth? If secular science declares the truth about the age of the earth to be millions and millions of years old, must Christians embrace that idea as truth, even in the face of clear biblical reality to the contrary? Are we to really echo the words spoken by Pilate when confronted with the truth, with the question, what is truth? This should not present such a difficult question for us. The answer is really quite simple. Listen carefully to the words of Jesus Christ that were recorded by the Apostle John.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And the Word became flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word. And if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
As trite as this may sound to you, it is by far the best advice I can give. We have the witness of the Creator of the universe indicating that his word is truth. It is not his word plus the opinions of scientific men. It is that his word is total truth. It is understood through diligent, all-encompassing study and prayer. His Word defines truth for us. It is not then that all truth is God's truth. It is rather that God's truth is all truth.
We look back upon history, and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has written of the rise and fall of great ones, that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my fellow countrymen, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made them mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed, cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I have seen an Italian clown say he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've heard a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Azoka. I have seen America, wealthier, and in terms of military weaponry, more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquests. All in one lifetime, all in one lifetime, all gone, gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. American, haunted by fears of running out of those precious fluids that keep their motorways roaring and the smog settling, with memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam, and the victories of the Don Quixote of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, all in one lifetime, all gone, gone with the wind. Behind the debris of these solemn supermen and self-styled imperial diplomatists, there stands the gigantic figure of one, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom alone, mankind may still have peace. The person of Jesus Christ. I present him as the way, the truth, and the life. Malcolm Muggeridge.
What were they thinking? Perhaps one of the more familiar of these blunders is by a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was the Roman governor of the province of Judea, who lived in the city of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. On the night of Jesus' betrayal by Judas, Jesus was first taken by the Jewish governing body called the Sanhedrin, who, after having illegally convened, they nevertheless conducted a kangaroo court in which they hurriedly passed judgment upon him, at which time he was passed on to the Roman court. While the Jewish law allowed the Sanhedrin to recommend and execute capital punishment, the Romans had prohibited them from doing so. Therefore, it was necessary for Pilate to become involved in what he apparently considered to be of little importance. It was neither his decision in this issue nor the outcome of his decision that makes him of interest to this particular study. It is instead a comment he makes in his interrogation of Jesus. Let's listen in on their conversation.
You are a king, then?
King is your word. My task is to bear witness to the truth.
Truth? What is truth?
Some might think Pilate to be significantly inquisitive and curious, to seek, one last thing, there are wolves in these hills, and if you see one, just yell, "Woof, woof," and we'll come running with pitchforks and clubs. So the young man agreed and followed their plan, and days went by. The young man found himself thoroughly enjoying the idyllic setting. One day, as he was resting and looking at the clouds, he thought he caught an unusual movement out in the corner of his eye. He sat up and looked more closely. There it was again, on the side of the mountain. Something was moving. Wolves, he thought anxiously. But something kept him from calling out for help. The object now moved closer, and it dawned on him it wasn't wolves at all. It was a lion. So he cried, "Lion, lion!" He glanced backward toward the village for the elders, but he saw no movement. He turned back again to locate the lion, and by this time the lion had worked its way to the edge of the meadow and was definitely beginning to stalk the sheep. So he cried louder, "Lion, lion!" Again, to his dismay, there was still no movement in the village. When he returned his attention to the flock, he saw that the lion was now approaching one of the sheep. He screamed at the top of his voice, "Lion, lion!" Still no help came from the village. Alas, it was now too late, for the lion was now tearing and rending through one of the sheep. The young man sank to the ground, benumbed and in shock. Slowly he got up and made his way. Hello, I'm Tom Sharp, and we welcome you to this third episode in a four-part series entitled The Foundations for a Biblical Worldview. So let's get started. Many men and women have been thrust onto the world stage in days gone by. Some are recognized for their good and positive contributions, and some for their evil that they've unleashed upon their fellow men. Some of these men and women sought to be recognized. They purposefully pursued their place and purpose in history. But others seem to have blundered their way into history, and in many instances, it is these that we inexplicably hold to a greater degree of responsibility for the ultimate impact of their life. When confronted with their seemingly unreasonable actions, we are frequently motivated to exclaim for a definition of truth from this Jewish rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth. A few theologians feel that Pilate was effectively echoing a similar response as did that of King Agrippa when confronted by the truth from the Apostle Paul.
Paul said to Agrippa, "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Acts 26:27-28.
But it is very possible that Pilate's response was motivated by entirely different reasons. Pilate was Roman through and through. While his birthplace is unknown, it was probably somewhere in Europe, well within the greater Roman Empire. Thus, we can reasonably and assuredly state that he was a product of that culture and mindset, one which we know to be deeply bathed in materialism and humanism. A predominant tenet found within Roman philosophy was the inability to ascertain a reality or truth that existed outside of oneself. When Pilate asked the question, "What is truth?" he is not really asking Jesus to relay to him an absolute, undeniable, self-existent truth that resided uniquely and totally in him. Rather, Pilate is acknowledging that this Jesus standing before him has asserted that he knows the truth, or more specifically, is the truth, which most likely Pilate thought to be merely his own tortured opinion. In Pilate's mind, the Jewish leaders who brought Jesus to him were wanting the Roman government to execute a man for expressing his opinion about a subject that everyone knows cannot violate any law, because there is no truth according to the Romans. When Pilate asked this famous question, "What is truth?" it was a flippant response to what he believed to be a childish statement. Even Jesus himself should know truth cannot be grasped as an absolute reality, thought Pilate. This, in turn, dictates Pilate's response to the crowd: "I find no fault in him." So how important is worldview? It can have dire consequences. The story is told of a little village that was tucked away in between two large mountain ranges. Now, this little village had a small flock of sheep, it is said, and in the course of time it became necessary to hire a shepherd. After a brief time of searching, the village elders settled on a particular young man, and to complete their interview, they took him out to the edge of the village to show him the sheep. "These will be your charges," they told him. They continued by telling him